In the middle of a lively rally, a little girl stepped forward and asked Donald Trump a question about God that stopped everyone in their tracks. What followed wasn't just an answer, it was something so heartfelt it moved her to tears. How could a simple question spark such an emotional moment from a man known for his tough exterior? Let us uncover what truly happened and why this moment caused the Pope himself to travel to the U.S. to meet Trump, the little girl who changed everything. Among the attendees was a little girl named Clara. She wasn't like the other kids in town who spent their afternoons playing tag or watching cartoons. Clara had a way of seeing the world that left even the adults scratching their heads. She wasn't loud or overly confident. In fact, she was often overlooked. But those who knew her well spoke of her deep, almost unnerving curiosity. Clara had a knack for asking the kinds of questions that made people stop and think, sometimes for hours. It wasn't that she was wise beyond her years, but her innocence gave her thoughts a clarity that many had lost long ago. Before we delve into this, it's clear that Clara's question struck a chord far deeper than anyone could have expected, and the answer will leave you more stunned than you can imagine. Clara's world was small but full of wonder. She lived in a modest house with her mother and younger brother. Her father had passed away when she was just a baby, leaving a quiet void that her questions often tried to fill. Her days were spent reading books that were too advanced for her age, wandering the fields behind her house, and scribbling down thoughts in a tattered notebook. This notebook, always tucked under her arm, was filled with words she didn't fully understand, but felt compelled to write. On this particular day, she had begged her mother to let her attend the rally. It wasn't that she cared much about politics. She barely knew what the word meant, but she had heard whispers about the man who would be speaking. He was larger than life, they said, a figure who stirred up strong feelings wherever he went. She wasn't interested in his fame or his power. She had a question she needed to ask, one that had been weighing on her small shoulders for weeks. The park filled quickly, a sea of faces reflecting every emotion imaginable: excitement, skepticism, indifference. Vendors shouted over the hum of conversations, selling everything from flags to hot dogs. Parents held onto their children's hands. Teenagers stood in clusters, scrolling through their phones. And elderly couples sat on foldable chairs they had brought from home. Yet, amidst the chaos, the girl stood still, her eyes fixed on the stage. To anyone watching, she looked like just another child, but inside her mind was a storm of thoughts. The event began with the usual fanfare. Local officials spoke first, their voices booming through the crackling speakers. The crowd clapped politely, but remained restless, waiting for the main act. When he finally appeared, the atmosphere shifted. Love him or hate him, there was no denying that this man commanded attention. His presence seemed to fill every corner of the park, and even she felt the weight of it. As the speech unfolded, it was what you'd expect: promises, anecdotes, and plenty of applause lines. She listened, but her thoughts wandered. She wasn't here for the politics or the spectacle. She was here because of something much bigger. Lately, she had been thinking a lot about God. It wasn't a new topic for her. In fact, it had been a constant in her life ever since she could remember. But recently, her questions had become more urgent. She wanted answers, real ones, not the kind that adults often gave to pacify children. She thought about the God her mother prayed to every night, the one her Sunday school teacher spoke of with such certainty. She thought about the stories she had read in the Bible, stories of miracles and compassion and justice. But she also thought about her father, about the emptiness his absence had left, and the unfairness of it all. If God was so powerful, why did things like that happen? Why did people have to hurt so much? These were the questions she carried with her to the rally, and she wasn't leaving without asking them. The moment came unexpectedly. The man on stage finished his prepared remarks and opened the floor to questions. At first, people hesitated, unsure if he really wanted to hear from them. But soon, hands shot up across the crowd. She waited, clutching her notebook tightly. She felt her heart pounding in her chest, a mix of fear and determination. When her hand went up, it was as though time slowed down. The man scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on her. He pointed, and suddenly all eyes were on the girl. She felt small, almost crushed by the weight of the moment. The microphone made its way to her, passed from hand to hand until it reached her trembling fingers. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was it. She was about to ask the question that had been haunting her, the question she couldn't keep to herself any longer. And though she didn't know it yet, her words were about to change everything. The crowd fell silent, their anticipation palpable. What could a little girl possibly have to ask that mattered in a setting like this? Most expected something trivial, maybe even amusing. But when she finally spoke, her voice clear and steady, despite her nerves, the question she posed cut through the air like a knife. It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge, a plea, and a spark all at once. And as the man on stage paused, visibly taken aback, it became clear that this wasn't going to be just another question and answer session. The sun had begun its descent, casting golden hues across the park as the energy in the air reached a fever pitch. A sudden roar from the crowd signaled his arrival. Trump, a name synonymous with controversy, power, and spectacle, made his entrance. He emerged from behind the stage with a deliberate stride, his trademark suit immaculate, his presence larger than life. The people reacted in waves. Some cheered with unrestrained enthusiasm, waving flags and signs, while others stood back, their expressions a mix of curiosity and doubt. The man had a way of filling a space, not just physically, but emotionally. His every move seemed calculated, his every gesture loaded with intent. Even those who opposed him couldn't deny the magnetic pull of his presence. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment as though it were a historic event. The crowd's energy mirrored the duality of his reputation. Admiration and skepticism coexisted in the same breath. For many, he was a symbol of hope and change. For others, a figure of contention. The girl stood near the back of the crowd, her small frame almost swallowed by the mass of people. She clutched her notebook tightly, her wide eyes taking in everything. Unlike the adults around her, she wasn't caught up in the frenzy of emotion. She wasn't there to cheer or jeer. She was there to observe, to understand. Her young mind processed the scene differently, noticing details others might miss. The slight hesitation in Trump's steps, the way his eyes scanned the crowd as though searching for something. As Trump approached the microphone, the noise gradually subsided, replaced by a tense silence. His voice, unmistakable and commanding, broke through the stillness. He spoke with the confidence of someone used to holding the attention of thousands. The crowd hung on his words, whether in agreement or dissent. She listened too, though her focus wasn't on the content of his speech. She watched him closely, noting how he carried himself, how his expressions shifted subtly as he spoke. The speech followed a familiar pattern: grand promises, bold claims, and moments designed to draw applause. The crowd reacted on cue, their cheers punctuating his sentences like exclamation marks. She remained still, her face unreadable. She wasn't impressed or unimpressed. She was simply observing, absorbing. Her thoughts wandered to her question, the one that had brought her here. It loomed in her mind, growing heavier with each passing moment. Then came the moment that changed everything. As Trump paused to take a sip of water, his eyes swept over the crowd. For a fleeting second, they met hers. It was an unremarkable moment to anyone else, but to her, it felt like the world had tilted. Her small stature and quiet demeanor made her almost invisible in the sea of people. Yet in that instant, she felt seen. The interaction was subtle, almost imperceptible. Trump's gaze lingered for just a second longer than it should have before moving on. She felt her heart race, though she couldn't explain why. It wasn't fear or excitement, but something deeper, a sense that her presence had been acknowledged in a way that defied logic. She tightened her grip on her notebook, the weight of her question pressing down on her chest. The crowd's energy surged again as Trump resumed speaking, but Clara barely noticed. She was lost in her thoughts, replaying that brief moment over and over. Her mind raced with possibilities. Did he see her? Did he sense the question she carried, the one she couldn't bring herself to voice just yet? It was a ridiculous notion, yet it clung to her like a shadow. As the speech continued, Clara's focus sharpened. She began to see the event differently, not as a spectacle, but as a stage set for something far greater. The cheers and jeers faded into the background, replaced by a quiet resolve. She didn't know how or when, but she knew she had to act. The question that had haunted her for weeks demanded an answer, and she couldn't leave without asking it. By the time Trump reached the final part of his speech, the crowd had settled into a rhythm. Clara's perspective, however, had shifted entirely. She was no longer a passive observer, but an active participant in a moment she didn't fully understand. Her presence, small and unassuming, felt significant in a way she couldn't explain. As Trump's words echoed across the park, Clara knew that her moment was approaching, and she had to be ready. The closing applause was deafening, a wave of sound that washed over the park. Trump stepped back from the microphone, waving to the crowd as they surged forward, eager for a closer look. Clara remained rooted to her spot, her eyes fixed on the stage. The question in her mind burned brighter than ever, a beacon guiding her toward what she couldn't yet see. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, she felt the weight of the moment settle over her. It was almost time. As the sun went down and people started moving, Clara felt something pulling her toward the stage, where her moment was waiting. Clara's moment in the spotlight. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and purple as the event began to wind down. The crowd, still buzzing with energy, lingered near the stage. Some were hoping for a closer glimpse of Trump, while others shared their thoughts in animated clusters. Yet, amidst the lively chatter, there was an almost imperceptible shift in the air. A presence, small and unassuming, began to emerge from the sea of people. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might drown out every other sound. Her small frame seemed to shrink further as she stepped forward, each movement deliberate and careful. The weight of her question pressed against her chest, a burden she could no longer carry in silence. She tightened her grip on her notebook, the rough texture grounding her in the surreal moment. She wasn't sure what compelled her to move, but it felt as though something far beyond her understanding was guiding her steps. The crowd didn't notice her at first. Adults were too engrossed in their conversations, their attention still fixed on the man who had held their focus for the past hour. But as she moved closer to the stage, heads began to turn. It was subtle at first, a ripple of curiosity spreading outward like a stone dropped in a still pond. The murmurs started softly, growing louder as more people became aware of the little girl pushing her way to the front. She felt their eyes on her, a mixture of confusion and intrigue. She was used to being overlooked, her presence often blending into the background. But now, she was at the center of their attention, and it was overwhelming. Her hands trembled as she clutched her notebook tighter, drawing strength from its familiar weight. She didn't look around, keeping her gaze fixed on the stage. The man who had captivated the crowd stood there, larger than life, his attention still on the throngs of supporters and critics vying for his acknowledgement. When she reached the edge of the stage, she stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath as she stood there, a tiny figure dwarfed by the grandeur of the moment. Her question was ready, burning inside her like a flame that refused to be extinguished. Yet, for a brief second, doubt crept in. What if her voice faltered? What if no one cared about her question, dismissed it as the musings of a child? But the weight of what she carried left no room for hesitation. Her voice, though small, was clear and steady as it cut through the noise. The crowd fell silent, the hum of anticipation replaced by a palpable tension. Her words weren't loud, but they carried a force that demanded attention. The simplicity of her question made it all the more profound. What does God mean to you? The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from disinterest or confusion. It was the kind that stems from collective astonishment. The crowd's faces reflected a range of emotions: surprise, curiosity, and for some, a quiet sense of awe. The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as if the universe itself had paused to listen. Trump, for all his charisma and quick wit, appeared momentarily caught off guard. His expression shifted, the confidence that usually defined his demeanor giving way to something more subdued. It wasn't hesitation exactly, but a rare moment of introspection. The man who had spent a lifetime commanding attention now stood before a question that demanded a different kind of response, one that couldn't be rehearsed or deflected. As the seconds stretched on, her presence seemed to grow larger in the crowd's eyes. She was no longer just a little girl, but a symbol of something greater. Her question carried a weight that transcended her age, touching on a topic that many avoided or struggled to articulate. And yet there she stood, unflinching, waiting for an answer. The crowd's astonishment wasn't solely directed at her boldness. There was something about her that felt different, almost otherworldly. Whispers began to circulate, each one adding another layer of intrigue to the moment. Some speculated about her past, noting the sadness in her eyes and the way she carried herself with a quiet intensity. Others suggested she was driven by a higher purpose, her question a reflection of something far beyond the ordinary. For her, the question wasn't born from a desire to challenge or impress. It came from a place of deep yearning, a need to understand something that had eluded her for so long. Her father's absence had left a void in her life, one that no amount of explanations or reassurances could fill. She had spent countless nights staring at the stars, her mind racing with questions that seemed too big for her small world. And now, here she was, standing in front of a man who embodied power and influence, asking the one question that mattered most to her. The moment felt suspended in time, every second stretching into eternity. The crowd's collective focus remained on her and the man who now faced her. The air was thick with anticipation, each person holding their breath as they waited to see what would happen next. Some hoped for a profound response, something that would validate the courage it took for her to ask her question. Others feared it would be dismissed, reduced to a passing moment in a sea of noise, but she didn't think about any of that. Her world had narrowed to the here and now, to the weight of her question and the hope that it might finally bring her some clarity. She didn't care about the crowd or the cameras or even the man himself. All that mattered was the answer, the one thing she had been searching for in the quiet corners of her mind. And as the silence stretched on, she stood her ground, a small figure with an unshakable resolve. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, people speculating about what would happen next. Some wondered if her question would be dismissed or if it would spark a moment of genuine reflection. Others debated the significance of her words, trying to understand why they carried such weight. But for her, there was no room for doubt or speculation. Her question was out in the open, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the park as the moment lingered. Her question hung in the air like a beacon, its simplicity masking the depth of its meaning. The crowd's attention, once divided and chaotic, had become singularly focused. And in that charged silence, something shifted, a sense that this moment was far greater than anyone there could have anticipated. Before the answer could come, the atmosphere itself seemed to change. The stillness carried an almost electric quality, as though the world was holding its breath. She stood at the center of it all, her small frame illuminated by the last rays of sunlight. She didn't waver or shrink under the weight of the moment. Instead, she stood taller, her presence radiating a quiet strength that belied her age. The crowd, for all their noise and energy, had fallen into a reverent silence. Each person felt the gravity of the question, their own thoughts turning inward as they considered what it meant to them. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the park bathed in twilight, it was clear that her question had already begun to ripple outward, touching the lives of everyone who had heard it. The quiet after Clara's question wasn't just stillness. It felt like it hung in the air, waiting for an answer no one expected, a question too big to ignore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the park was bathed in a soft twilight. The weight of Clara's question seemed to hang in the air, an invisible force that silenced even the most restless among the crowd. Trump stood on the stage, his usual air of confidence momentarily replaced by something uncharacteristically subdued. For a man so accustomed to quick quips and decisive responses, the question had landed with an unexpected gravity. It wasn't just the words, "What does God mean to you?" but the way they had been asked, with an innocence and urgency that defied dismissal. Trump's hand rested lightly on the podium as he looked out over the sea of faces, but his gaze seemed far away. The crowd, waiting with bated breath, had grown eerily still. Even the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird seemed to hold back, as though the world itself had paused to listen. For the first time in what felt like ages, Trump didn't have an immediate answer. The practiced lines and rehearsed anecdotes he often relied on felt hollow in the face of something so profound. He shifted his weight slightly, his posture less rigid, and his expression softened. The man who often embodied bravado and certainty now looked almost human, as though the question had peeled back a layer of armor he hadn't even realized he was wearing. It wasn't hesitation exactly, but a deep sense of reflection that seemed to take hold of him. In that moment, Trump wasn't a politician or a public figure. He was simply a man standing before a truth he couldn't ignore. As he stood there, visibly grappling with the question, the crowd's energy began to shift. The usual polarization of emotions, adoration and disdain, faded, replaced by a shared sense of anticipation. It was as though everyone present could feel the significance of the moment, even if they couldn't quite articulate why. Clara's question had pierced through the noise and spectacle, touching on something universal and deeply personal all at once. For Trump, the silence stretched on like an eternity. Memories began to surface, unbidden and vivid, pulling him back through the years. He thought about his childhood, the quiet moments spent in church with his family, the sermons he had only half listened to but still remembered. He thought about the times he had faced challenges that seemed insurmountable, moments when he had felt utterly alone. And he thought about the small, almost imperceptible instances where things had worked out in ways that defied logic, leaving him wondering if there had been a hand guiding him all along. The memories came in waves, each one carrying a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged before. He remembered standing at the edge of failure during a particularly turbulent time in his career, the sense of despair so overwhelming it had felt like a physical weight. And yet, against all odds, an opportunity had appeared, one so improbable it could only be described as a stroke of fate. He had dismissed it at the time, attributing it to luck or his own resilience. But now, standing on this stage, he began to see it differently. The crowd watched as his expression shifted, the internal struggle playing out in subtle changes to his demeanor. There was a vulnerability in his posture, a quiet intensity in his eyes that was impossible to ignore. For a man so often defined by his larger-than-life persona, the transformation was striking. He wasn't performing or posturing, he was simply present, fully immersed in the weight of the question. Slowly, Trump straightened, his hands gripping the edges of the podium as though anchoring himself. The tension in the crowd was palpable, every person hanging on the edge of expectation. When he finally began to speak, his voice was softer than usual, the usual bravado replaced by a measured tone. His words didn't come in a rehearsed stream, but in deliberate, thoughtful phrases, each one carrying the weight of his reflection. He spoke of moments in his life that had shaped him, times when he had been forced to confront his own limitations and the fragility of human existence. He mentioned the people who had influenced him, from family members to mentors, each one leaving an indelible mark on his path. But what stood out most was his admission of doubt, the moments when he had questioned everything, including the existence of a higher power. The crowd's reaction was a mix of surprise and emotion. To hear someone so often associated with certainty and confidence admit to vulnerability was unexpected. It was as though the question had stripped away the layers of persona, revealing the human being beneath. The usual divisions among the audience, supporters and critics alike, seemed to dissolve, replaced by a collective sense of introspection. Clara's question had done more than challenge Trump. It had challenged everyone present to confront their own beliefs and experiences. As Trump continued, he shared a story that seemed to encapsulate the essence of his reflection. It was a memory from years ago, a moment of quiet desperation when he had found himself alone in a hospital room, waiting for news about a loved one. The details were sparse, but the emotions were raw, his words painting a picture of a man brought to his knees by the uncertainty of life. In that room, he had prayed, not out of habit or obligation, but out of a deep, unspoken need for something greater than himself. The story resonated with the crowd in a way few things had. It wasn't just the content, but the sincerity with which it was told. Trump's usual confidence was still there, but it was tempered by humility, a recognition of the limits of human control. The story wasn't about politics or power. It was about the shared human experience of searching for meaning in the face of the unknown. As he reached the end of his response, Trump's voice grew steadier, the initial hesitation replaced by a quiet conviction. He didn't offer a definitive answer to Clara's question. Instead, he spoke of his ongoing path, the way his understanding of God had evolved over time. He admitted that he didn't have all the answers, but he believed in the importance of seeking them, of remaining open to the possibility of something greater. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of applause and quiet reflection. Some wiped away tears, moved by the unexpected vulnerability of the moment. Others stood in silence, their thoughts turned inward as they considered their own beliefs. Clara, still standing near the edge of the stage, felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't expected a perfect answer. She had only hoped for sincerity, and in that moment, she felt that she had received it. As the event came to a close, the atmosphere in the park was markedly different from when it had begun. The usual noise and chaos of a political rally had been replaced by a profound stillness, a sense that something extraordinary had taken place. Clara's question had left an indelible mark, not just on Trump, but on everyone who had heard it. And as the crowd began to disperse, the weight of the moment lingered, a reminder of the power of a single question to change everything. As the crowd began to settle from the emotional crescendo of Trump's response, all eyes turned to the little girl who had posed the question. Clara stood rooted to her spot, her small figure illuminated by the fading light. Her cheeks glistened with tears that she made no effort to wipe away. These weren't tears of sadness. They were something far more complex. Her face was a portrait of emotion, a mixture of relief, understanding, and a profound sense of connection that no one around her could fully grasp. The moment was surreal. Clara's reaction seemed to transcend words, speaking instead to something deep and universal. Those closest to her could see the way her small hands clutched her notebook, as though holding onto it might anchor her in this overwhelming moment. For a child who had spent so much of her life asking questions, often without receiving satisfying answers, this moment felt like a culmination. The response she had heard wasn't perfect or complete, but it was enough. It was honest, and in its honesty, it gave her a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The crowd, still processing Trump's deeply personal story, now found themselves drawn to Clara. The sight of her standing there, tears streaming down her face, struck a chord in the hearts of those who witnessed it. Conversations hushed, and the usual hum of a dispersing crowd was replaced by an almost reverent silence. People watched her with a mixture of curiosity and empathy, as though they too felt the weight of whatever she was experiencing. In that silence, glimpses of Clara's past seemed to surface, unspoken but felt by those who had gathered around her. She was no stranger to questions of faith and meaning. Her life, though short, had been marked by challenges that few her age could comprehend. Her father's absence loomed large, a shadow that shaped her understanding of loss and longing. Yet, her questions about God and purpose were not born solely out of pain. They came from a place of hope, a belief that there had to be something greater, something that connected all the seemingly disparate threads of her life. Clara's mother often spoke of her daughter's uncanny ability to see beyond the surface. Even as a toddler, Clara had a way of making people pause and think, her innocent observations carrying an unexpected depth. Her questions weren't just inquiries, they were invitations to reflect, to explore. And while many adults dismissed them as the musings of a curious child, those who truly listened found themselves changed by her words. It was as though Clara's curiosity was a gift, one that allowed her to touch on truths that others struggled to articulate. The tears continued to fall as Clara stood in the fading light, her small shoulders rising and falling with each steady breath. Her mind raced with thoughts and memories, fragments of conversations and moments that now seemed to align in a way they hadn't before. She thought of her father, the stories her mother had told her about his unwavering faith even in the face of hardship. She thought of the nights she had spent staring at the stars, her notebook open on her lap, writing down questions she couldn't yet answer. And she thought of the response she had just heard, its sincerity resonating with the truth she hadn't been able to put into words. The crowd's focus on Clara created an atmosphere unlike anything the park had ever seen. Strangers exchanged glances, their own emotions mirrored in the faces around them. Some wiped away their own tears, moved by the rawness of the moment. Others stood in quiet contemplation, their thoughts turned inward as they grappled with the question that had sparked it all. It wasn't just about Clara anymore. Her reaction had become a catalyst, a mirror reflecting the crowd's own unspoken questions and doubts. The stillness in the park felt almost sacred, as though the space had been transformed by the weight of what had just unfolded. Clara's tears were a reminder of the power of vulnerability, of the courage it took to ask questions that others might avoid. And in her reaction, there was a sense of release, a letting go of the heaviness she had carried for so long. It wasn't that she suddenly had all the answers. It was that she had found a sense of peace in the search itself. As the crowd began to disperse, a few lingered near Clara, unsure whether to approach or give her space. Her small frame seemed almost fragile in the twilight, but there was a strength in the way she held herself, a quiet resilience that belied her age. Some felt compelled to speak to her, to offer words of comfort or gratitude, but the weight of the moment held them back. It was as though they understood that this was her moment, one that didn't need to be interrupted by well-meaning gestures. Clara, for her part, was only dimly aware of the people around her. Her focus was inward, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. The question she had carried for so long no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a key, one that had unlocked something within her. She couldn't explain it, not yet, but she knew that something fundamental had shifted. The sense of emptiness that had so often accompanied her questions was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of fulfillment. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the park took on a different kind of beauty. The colors of dusk gave way to the soft glow of streetlights, casting long shadows that danced in the gentle breeze. Clara finally wiped her cheeks, the tears slowing but her emotions still raw. She looked down at her notebook, its pages filled with the thoughts and questions that had defined so much of her life. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to write. The answer she had sought, wasn't one that could be captured in words. It was something she felt deep within her, an understanding that transcended language. The people who had witnessed the moment would go on to tell the story, each adding their own interpretations and embellishments. Some would focus on Trump's response, others on Clara's question, and still others on the extraordinary atmosphere that had enveloped the park. But for Clara, the story wasn't about what had been said or how it had been received. It was about the quiet transformation that had taken place within her, the way her question had led her to a place of clarity she hadn't known was possible. As she walked away from the stage, her notebook still clutched tightly in her hand, Clara felt a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The burden of her questions, the weight of her doubts, had been lifted, replaced by a sense of connection and purpose. She didn't know where her path would lead her, but for the first time she felt at peace with the uncertainty. And as she disappeared into the night, the echoes of her question lingered, a reminder of the power of curiosity and the courage it took to seek the truth. Even though Clara's question had been asked, its meaning was still spreading through the crowd, making everyone think deeply about it. The crowd that left changed. The park, once teeming with the boisterous energy of a political rally, now held an entirely different kind of atmosphere. It was as though a collective stillness had taken over, a quiet that spoke volumes more than the cheers and chants that had filled the air earlier. The crowd, still lingering after the exchange between Trump and the little girl, seemed caught in a moment of shared reflection. The usual divisions of opinion and personality were momentarily forgotten, replaced by a sense of unity that was as profound as it was unexpected. People began to move in small clusters, their conversations subdued but charged with emotion. Some walked away in silence, their faces etched with thoughts they couldn't yet put into words. Others gathered in groups, their voices low as they tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. For many, the rally had been an event like any other, a spectacle of sound and fury, of promises and posturing, but now it had transformed into something else entirely, a moment of reckoning that had touched everyone in a deeply personal way. Among the crowd were skeptics who had come with no intention of being moved. They had stood with crossed arms and skeptical expressions, ready to dismiss every word from the stage. But Clara's question and Trump's response had pierced through their defenses in a way they hadn't anticipated. Some found themselves questioning long-held beliefs, their cynicism giving way to a sense of vulnerability they weren't accustomed to. It wasn't that their skepticism had disappeared entirely, but it had been tempered by the realization that even the most jaded among them could be moved by sincerity. Believers, too, found themselves changed by the experience. Many had come to the rally with their faith intact, but Clara's question and the ensuing exchange had reignited something within them. It was as though her courage had reminded them of the importance of their own questions, the ones they had been too afraid or too complacent to ask. For some, the moment felt like a call to action, a reminder to live their faith more fully and to seek answers with the same determination that Clara had shown. The ripple effect of the moment extended far beyond the park itself. Word of the exchange spread quickly, carried by those who had witnessed it firsthand and amplified by social media. Stories began to emerge, each one adding another layer to the narrative. Some focused on Clara's question, marveling at the depth of her curiosity and the courage it took to ask it. Others highlighted Trump's response, noting the vulnerability and introspection that had surfaced in a man often defined by his confidence. Together, these accounts wove a tapestry of human connection, a story that resonated with people from all walks of life. The park itself seemed transformed in the aftermath of the event. The physical space, once a backdrop for political speeches and public gatherings, had taken on an almost sacred quality. People lingered long after the rally had officially ended, drawn to the spot as though it held some kind of power. Strangers shared quiet moments of connection, their conversations marked by a newfound openness and honesty. It was as though the exchange between Clara and Trump had unlocked something in the collective consciousness, a willingness to engage with questions that had long been avoided. Clara, for her part, had left the park with her mother not long after the crowd began to disperse. Yet her presence lingered in the minds of those who had seen her. To many, she had become a symbol, a reminder of the power of curiosity and the courage it took to seek answers in a world often content with easy certainties. Her small stature and quiet demeanor belied the impact she had made, her question reverberating through the crowd long after she had gone. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of the moment continued to spread. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a rare instance of vulnerability and connection in an increasingly polarized world. Social media buzzed with discussions, people sharing their own interpretations and reflections. Some recounted how the event had inspired them to reconnect with their faith, while others spoke of the questions it had raised about their own beliefs. The story, though deeply personal, had become a shared experience, a mirror reflecting the hopes and fears of a divided nation. Within the crowd, individual stories began to emerge, each one adding to the richness of the moment. A young mother, who had brought her children to the rally out of curiosity, found herself moved to tears by Clara's question. She later described how it had prompted her to reevaluate her priorities, to think more deeply about the kind of examples she wanted to set for her children. An older man, who had long struggled with his faith, spoke of how the exchange had reminded him of the questions he had pushed aside for years. And a teenager, who had attended the rally with friends, shared how the moment had inspired him to start asking his own questions, to seek out his own truths. The stories were as varied as the people who told them, but they all shared a common thread: the sense that something extraordinary had taken place. It wasn't just the question or the response, but the way the moment had brought people together, cutting through the noise and division that so often define public gatherings. For a brief time, the barriers that separated people, beliefs, backgrounds, experiences, seemed to fade, replaced by a shared sense of humanity. As the days turned into weeks, the moment began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just a story about a little girl and a powerful man. It had become a symbol of something greater. People who had never met Clara or attended the rally found themselves inspired by her courage and the depth of her question. Churches and community groups held discussions, using the event as a starting point for conversations about faith, doubt, and the importance of seeking answers. The story, though rooted in a single moment, had grown into a movement, one that encouraged people to look beyond themselves and engage with the questions that mattered most. For those who had been there, the memory of the event remained vivid. They spoke of the way the air had seemed to change, the sense of connection that had bound them together in a way that defied explanation. Some described it as a spiritual experience, while others simply called it a moment of truth. Whatever the words, the feeling was the same, a sense that they had been part of something far greater than themselves. Clara's question continued to resonate, not just because of its depth, but because of the way it had been asked. Her innocence and sincerity had cut through the cynicism and noise, reminding people of the power of vulnerability. In a world that often valued certainty and strength, Clara's question was a reminder of the importance of humility, of the courage it took to admit that not all questions had easy answers. And in her tears, the crowd had seen something they couldn't ignore, a reflection of their own struggles, their own doubts, their own humanity. The transformation that had begun in the park continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways that no one could have predicted. It wasn't a sudden or dramatic change. Rather, it was a quiet shift, a series of small moments that added up to something profound. People began to ask their own questions, to seek out their own truths, and in doing so, they found themselves connected to something larger, a shared path that transcended the boundaries of belief and background. The park, now quiet and empty, remained a testament to the moment that had unfolded there. The physical space hadn't changed, but its meaning had. It was no longer just a park. It was a place where people had come together, where a single question had sparked a transformation that no one could have anticipated. And as the seasons changed and life moved on, the memory of that day lingered, a reminder of the power of curiosity, courage, and connection. The morning after the event, the airwaves buzzed with the story that had taken the small town by storm. National and local news outlets splashed headlines across screens and papers, each one putting its own spin on the extraordinary moment. Some were straightforward. A little girl's question stuns political rally. Others leaned into the sensational, the question that left Trump speechless. Still, others veered toward skepticism. Scripted or sincere, the viral moment everyone's talking about. The media's fascination with the story was immediate and unrelenting. Clips of the exchange between Clara and Trump circulated online, drawing millions of views within hours. Social media platforms exploded with debates as users dissected every detail of the event. The video of Clara's tearful reaction, in particular, became a focal point, with commentators analyzing her body language and speculating about her emotions. To some, she was a symbol of purity and courage. To others, a pawn in a carefully orchestrated spectacle. Talk shows and opinion panels seized on the story, each offering a different interpretation. Political pundits debated the implications of Trump's response, with some praising his vulnerability and others accusing him of calculated theatrics. Religious leaders weighed in, framing the moment as a powerful testament to the enduring importance of faith in public life. Skeptics, however, questioned the authenticity of the exchange, suggesting it might have been staged to humanize a polarizing figure. The truth, as always, was elusive, and the debates only fueled public curiosity. Amid the media frenzy, Clara herself became an unwitting celebrity. Photos of her from the rally, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the fading sunlight, appeared on magazine covers and news websites. Journalists descended on the small town, eager to uncover every detail about the little girl who had captured the nation's attention. They interviewed neighbors, teachers, and family friends, piecing together a portrait of a quiet, introspective child with an uncanny ability to ask profound questions. But even as they uncovered details about her life, Clara remained a question, her motives and emotions defying easy explanation. Stories about Clara's background began to circulate, each one adding another layer of intrigue. Some focused on her father's untimely death, painting a picture of a child shaped by loss and longing. Others highlighted her deep curiosity and love of learning, recounting anecdotes about her habit of asking questions that left adults speechless. There were even whispers of something more mystical, with a few suggesting that Clara's question had been inspired by a divine calling. These narratives, though varied, shared a common thread, the sense that Clara was no ordinary child. Public reactions to the story were as diverse as the media coverage. For many, the event was a source of inspiration, a reminder of the power of sincerity and the importance of asking difficult questions. Social media platforms were flooded with posts from people sharing their own stories of faith and doubt, their words echoing the themes of the rally. Hashtags like #ClarasQuestion and #FaithInAction trended for days, connecting strangers through a shared sense of reflection. Others, however, were more cynical. Critics dismissed the moment as a publicity stunt, accusing the organizers of exploiting Clara's innocence for political gain. Conspiracy theories proliferated, with some claiming the entire exchange had been scripted and rehearsed. These voices, though loud, were often drowned out by the overwhelming tide of people who found meaning in the event. For every skeptic, there seemed to be 10 more who saw Clara's question as a genuine and transformative moment. The story's impact extended beyond the realm of public opinion. sparking tangible actions in communities across the country. Churches reported an increase in attendance as people sought to reconnect with their faith in the wake of the event. Community groups organized discussions and workshops, using Clara's question as a starting point for conversations about spirituality and purpose. Even schools got involved, with teachers incorporating the story into lessons about empathy, courage, and the importance of asking questions. As the story continued to unfold, the questions surrounding Clara deepened. Journalists and online sleuths dug into her life, searching for clues about what had inspired her to ask such a profound question. Some pointed to her father's death as the key, suggesting that her question was a reflection of her own search for meaning in the face of loss. Others speculated about her upbringing, noting the influence of her mother's quiet strength and unwavering faith. But for all their efforts, no one could fully explain Clara's question or the impact it had on those who heard it. Theories abounded, but the truth remained elusive, adding to the story's appeal. Clara herself stayed out of the spotlight, her family choosing to shield her from the media frenzy. This absence only heightened the public's fascination as people projected their own interpretations onto the little girl who had sparked a national conversation. The media's focus on Clara didn't come without consequences. Some criticized the relentless coverage, arguing that it placed undue pressure on a child who had simply asked a question. Others worried that the story's true meaning was being overshadowed by the spectacle of its reporting. These concerns, though valid, did little to slow the momentum of the narrative, which continued to captivate audiences around the world. As weeks turned into months, the story began to take on a life of its own. Books were written, documentaries produced, and art created, all inspired by the moment that had unfolded in the park. Clara's question became a symbol, a touchstone for those grappling with their own beliefs and uncertainties. It was no longer just about a little girl and a political rally. It was about the power of curiosity, the courage to seek answers, and the connections that bind us all. Through it all, Clara's family remained steadfast in their decision to keep her life private. They declined interview requests and avoided public appearances, choosing instead to focus on their own healing and growth. Clara herself returned to her quiet routines, her notebook once again filled with the questions that shaped her world. But even as she retreated from the spotlight, the impact of her question continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined. For the public, the story of Clara and her question became a lens through which to examine their own lives. It was a reminder of the importance of vulnerability, of the courage it took to ask questions that had no easy answers. And in a world often defined by division and noise, it was a rare moment of connection, a shared experience that brought people together in their search for meaning. The headlines eventually faded, replaced by new stories and fresh controversies. But the memory of Clara's question lingered, a quiet echo that refused to be silenced. It lived on in the conversations it had sparked, the lives it had touched, and the hearts it had opened. And for those who had been there, who had witnessed the moment firsthand, it remained a testament to the power of a single question to change everything. Years later, people would still talk about the little girl who asked a big question that touched hearts and changed lives. The question that lives on. Years after the moment that captivated a nation, the story of Clara's question lived on. It had woven itself into the fabric of public consciousness, becoming a symbol of courage, vulnerability, and the power of asking what truly matters. For some, it was a story passed down in families, told around dinner tables or during quiet evenings. For others, it was a case study in classrooms or a topic of debate in philosophical circles. The event had transcended its origins, becoming part of a larger narrative about faith, humanity, and the enduring quest for meaning. In towns and cities far removed from the park where it all began, people still spoke of the little girl who had dared to ask the unanswerable. Her question, so simple and yet so profound, continued to echo in the minds of those who had heard it, either firsthand or through the countless retellings. The phrase, "What does God mean to you?" had taken on a life of its own, appearing on posters, in sermons, and even as the inspiration for works of art and music. It was a question that invited introspection, challenging people to look beyond their routines and confront the deeper truths of their existence. Clara herself had grown up far from the public eye, her family's choice to protect her privacy respected by most, yet her presence lingered like a quiet force, felt even in her absence. Those who had met her described her as unassuming, a child who seemed ordinary at first glance, but whose words carried an almost inexplicable weight. Her notebook, filled with questions and musings, became something of a legend in its own right, though no one outside her family had ever seen its contents. It was said that Clara continued to write in it, even as she grew older, her curiosity about the world never fading. The park where the event had unfolded became something of a pilgrimage site, drawing visitors from near and far. Some came to stand where Clara had stood, hoping to feel even a fraction of the connection she had inspired. Others came to reflect, finding solace in the quiet beauty of the space. Over time, a small plaque was installed, commemorating the moment and the question that had sparked it. It read simply, "In this place, a question was asked that reminded us all to seek the truth." For those who had been in the crowd that day, the memory remained vivid. They spoke of the stillness that had settled over the park, the way the air had seemed to change as Clara's words hung in the air. Some described it as a spiritual experience, while others saw it as a rare moment of collective humanity. Whatever their interpretation, they all agreed on one thing: it was a moment that had left them changed. Many admitted that they had carried Clara's question with them ever since, returning to it in times of doubt or uncertainty. The legacy of the event extended far beyond those who had been present. It became a touchstone for discussions about faith and doubt, about the importance of asking questions even when answers were elusive. Religious leaders incorporated the story into their teachings, using it as a reminder of the humility and openness required to engage with the divine. Educators saw it as a lesson in courage, pointing to Clara's willingness to voice her thoughts in a setting that might have intimidated even the most confident adult. But the story was not without its skeptics. Over the years, questions about its authenticity resurfaced, fueled by those who doubted the spontaneity of the moment. Conspiracy theories abounded, suggesting that the entire event had been orchestrated for political or personal gain. These voices, though persistent, never managed to overshadow the story's impact. For most, the question of authenticity was secondary to the meaning they had found in the moment itself. Whether or not every detail was as it seemed, the truth of Clara's courage and the power of her question remained undeniable. As time passed, the story began to take on an almost mythic quality. Details blurred and new interpretations emerged, each one adding to the richness of the narrative. Some focused on Clara's innocence, seeing her as a symbol of childlike faith and wonder. Others emphasized the universality of her question, noting how it resonated across cultures and beliefs. There were even those who saw her as a modern-day prophet, a vessel through which a deeper truth had been revealed. The beauty of the story lay in its openness, its ability to mean different things to different people. In the final years of her life, Clara remained as strange as ever. She rarely spoke about the moment that had defined her childhood, choosing instead to let others interpret it as they wished. Yet those who knew her best said that the question she had asked that day was only the beginning. Her curiosity had continued to shape her life, leading her down paths of exploration and discovery. She had never stopped asking questions, never stopped seeking the truths that lay just beyond her reach. One of the last known photographs of Clara shows her standing in the park, now a woman in her later years. She is holding her notebook, its pages as worn and weathered as the hands that grip it. Her expression is serene, her eyes filled with the same quiet intensity that had captivated a nation all those years ago. Those who saw the photograph remarked on her smile, a small, strange curve that seemed to hold a world of meaning. It was as though she carried the weight of all her questions lightly, content in the knowledge that the search itself was enough. Was Trump's response a genuine moment of faith, or was it a calculated move to win hearts? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.